2012, a couple of early Bitcoiners get together and say, listen, this thing about we're going to be completely decentralized and distributed is really tough to do if we're going to coordinate effort. And so Gavin Andreessen, who at the time had primary commit access and was given that by Satoshi Nakamoto, and a couple of other early Bitcoiners kind of got together and created this thing called the Bitcoin Foundation. And fairly recently, I got involved end of sort of July last year, and that's largely a function of the fact that the board believes that some of the most important use cases for Bitcoin actually exist in emerging technologies or rather emerging markets. And so our story kind of starts November 2015 in India, specifically 500 rupee notes. And it tells us a little bit about where our financial system is today. And so what the Indian government decided to do in November 2015 is it said within 24 hours that the 500 rupee note and the 1,000 rupee note was no longer legal tender, and that the only way that you could exchange it for legal tender was that you needed to take it from underneath your mattress, and you needed to go to a bank, and you needed to explain why you had that amount of money and where you got it from. And as you can imagine, chaos ensued. And just recently, the Indian government went back on that decision, and they said, no, we're going to print the 500 rupee note again. But the principle here is that for the first time, we've been led to believe throughout our lives that money has value because our government and our central bank, in fact, says that money has value. And what this process called demonetization does is it says that that is only true for as long as the government chooses for it to be so. The second point is that, and which is the second lie that exists in the system, is that the global reserve currency, the US dollar, if you look at its value over 100 years, it is worth less than 95%, worth less than 5% of its original value. So the idea that the most stable currency, the one that is supposed to be arguably best at looking after our financial futures, is the one that is, as in any other fiat currency, has lost that much value, tells us that this idea that as long as we keep saving, as long as we keep squirreling away money, we're going to be okay, is not true. And so, aside from those fundamental problems in the system, the financial services system doesn't actually serve everybody. And if we look at, say, for example, data from sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and South Asia, then we quickly find that less than 30 to 50% of the adult population have access to a bank account. Only about 10% actually have access to formal savings, and less than 5% have access to formal borrowing. So the financial system as it exists today actually only serves about the top quintile, maybe the top 2 quintiles. It's not a system that is inclusive. And so there is a lot of talk about deploying technology that underlies Bitcoin and saying, well, we'll make the system better. We're going to use this thing called whatever, insert term here, distributed ledger technology or blockchain. But the principle is that it's not so much a question of can we make the current operators more efficient. It's a problem that our financial system is fundamentally flawed. We are sitting in a situation today where the world debt is around about $250 trillion. World GDP is about $80 trillion. So we owe 3 times more than what we produce on an annual basis. And so it's not going to be better until we start to look at the fundamentals of, is this the way that we should be providing financial services? And more importantly, the idea that the people that are working on those technologies that underlie Bitcoin and saying, well, we'll implement those kinds of technologies into other financial services industries, there is no reason to believe at this stage, and admittedly it's early days, but there's no reason to believe that we're not just creating another gatekeeper, not just creating another toll. Because if you look even at data, for example, from January 2017, there are, and it takes 18 months for the US Patent Office to make available patents that have registered, there are already 36 blockchain patents that are in process. And there's no reason to believe that that is going to stop. So people are trying to capture whatever value they're able to out of this technology, which was ultimately a gift for all of us. And so it's not a question of they're all bad, we're all good. It's a fact that we shouldn't live in a world where we believe that it will be okay as long as we just implement this technology, because it's not going to be the case. So where does the Bitcoin story start? Global financial crisis, 2008. The first Bitcoin Genesis block is mined January 3, 2009. And in a memo field attached to the Genesis block, it talks about the fact that the UK Chancellor was looking at the second bailout for UK banks. So Bitcoin is very much a consequence of the fact that there was a deep mistrust of the system, and more importantly, there was a deep mistrust of the fact that the people that were most affected by the 2008 bank bailout were, in fact, those people that were poor in developing markets. Because as soon as consumer demand in developed markets started to dry up in advance of monetary easing, suddenly people weren't being employed in those markets that were manufacturing those products that should have been consumed in the developed markets. So Bitcoin at its very heart is all about changing the system. It's not about making the system more efficient. So what does that network look like today? So this is a map of the Bitcoin nodes. And a node in the Bitcoin world is essentially a computer that is running a copy of the blockchain, the protocol software, and effectively validates the transactions on the network. So what it tells us is that the Bitcoin network is all over the world, predominantly in North America and in Western Europe. And in South Africa, we have 13 full nodes, for those of you that are interested in knowing that. And effectively, what it means is that any two of the points on this map, as long as I can connect to at least one of those points on the map, I am able to transact. And that tells us that this is something very unique and something very special. It can't be shut down. It is not controlled by anybody. It cannot be coerced into doing anything. I don't own it. I don't control it. It is a gift to all of us. And it would be such a terrible waste if we didn't take advantage of this gift. So if we look at what is the current state of Bitcoin adoption, a couple of years ago we might have said, well, we're trying to use it as an alternative form of cash. And so we'd say, well, how much e-commerce is being done in Bitcoin today? And I would argue that based upon the current status of the Bitcoin network, that would be the wrong measurement. And I think that there is a network called Local Bitcoins, and effectively what Local Bitcoins does is it enables peer-to-peer transacting, so cash for Bitcoin. And in an African context, what it tells us is that most of that kind of exchange activity in South Africa was being done on local Bitcoins, but arguably as there's more liquidity in the local exchanges like Llew, we have more of that transacting happening on the exchanges. And more recently, Nigeria has seen a dramatic increase in the amount of Bitcoin that is being exchanged peer-to-peer, so around about 1,500 Bitcoin per week. And Kenya, there is not much activity going on there, but it's a reflection of the fact that Kenya was very early to this game and in fact already has M-Pesa. Now, in the bigger scheme of things, South African market is still very small. On local Bitcoins, we probably account for about 5% of the network activity. But on local Bitcoins itself, we're looking at about 25,000 Bitcoins per week that are exchanged. So around about $30 million of transactional activity that happens on local Bitcoin every week. A little bit more of what's going on in the network. So this is data from last week. It tells us that last week the miners earned just over $14 million. The average price of Bitcoin was about $1,164. About 1.6 million transactions on the network, and 13,662 new Bitcoins were mined last week. So the interesting thing about this evolving space is that as more money goes into the system becomes more resistant to change. And there's a good reason for that. And so a lot of the innovation that is happening in this cryptocurrency space is not necessarily happening in Bitcoin on the live system. In fact, it's certainly not happening on the live system. And so there are lots of other tokens out there which kind of confuse some of the issues. And I think that we view the alternative cryptocurrencies as fundamentally positive for the ecosystem, aside from some of the MLM scams. Because what they enable everybody to do is test new things. So if you look at some of these tokens, they'll tell us, for example, that Ripple is trying to solve the problem of interbank settlement. They'll tell us that Monero is trying to solve the problem of greater privacy in transactions. They tell us that Dash has implemented things like government governance in the protocol to make it easier to make decisions, to make it easier to make changes to the software, and to find other ways to pay for protocol development and administration. Will these ultimately make their way into Bitcoin. My argument is that the more utility there is and the more value that these create, the more likely we're going to see those kinds of changes being implemented into Bitcoin. But the first problem that we have in Bitcoin is that we have to talk about the fact that there is still a perception that Bitcoin exists fundamentally to serve illegal transactions. And it's not true. And the reason why so many people believe this story is that it is too easy to believe that because you can do illegal things on Bitcoin, you will do illegal things on Bitcoin. And I think that it's more a function of the fact that Bitcoin is actually pretty good money. And it works even more effectively than cash in certain ways. And so I think that it's a little bit like the early days of digital marketing. The first users of digital marketing were not the big brands. They were the sin industries. And the reason why they were the sin industries is because they couldn't get access to radio, TV, and print advertising. And when other people realized that you were getting good results out of using digital marketing, they said, we should try this out as well. And I don't think anybody today would say that digital marketing is fundamentally for promoting illegal or sin industries. So that is going to change. There isn't enough factual information that suggests that there is a lot of illegal activity happening on the network. People tend to cite Silk Road, and more recently there was an example of somebody who was arrested, but because they used coin analysis or chain analysis, and they managed to detect the fact that there was some illegal activity happening. Now, it's not that there is the principle here is that we are never told what the value of these things are. So we get very, very nervous about what could be happening rather than what is happening. And what sometimes happens is that somebody does something illegal, and somewhere along the line there, they have like, I don't know, 1 Bitcoin or half a Bitcoin or something like that, and people are like, haha, see, told you, there's Bitcoin that's part of this illegal activity. So we've got to overcome that. It's not really about that. It's actually much more about a payment network that is available to all of us. The other thing that we have to overcome is this perception that privacy in transactions is a bad thing, and that we should be disclosing all of what's happening in our financial life to everybody else, our banks, our regulators, because just in case we're doing something that might be considered illegal. And I think that the best explanation that I've ever heard for this is that there is a difference between privacy and secrecy. When you go into the bathroom and you close the door, we know exactly what's going on there, but you're entitled to your privacy. And we need to get used to this idea that we're entitled to privacy. We should not have to disclose exactly what we're doing with our money. That does not mean that those that do not disclose are doing illegal things. And we should fight for that right. The other thing that is very interesting about Bitcoin is that it's very easy to get the perception, particularly if you're in the US, that Bitcoin is controlled by the Chinese. And so this is a picture of a Bitcoin mine in Sichuan province in China. And as you can see, it's in the middle of nowhere. And that's really one of the reasons why it works. So let me give you a bit of background. The good thing about having a government that is capable of doing central decision-making is that you can decide far in advance to do things like provide power generation capabilities in rural China, only to realize much later on that when the commodity prices drop, that you don't actually need all that generation capacity. And so one of the reasons why they created a lot of this capacity in rural China is that China has got a big urbanization problem. There are too many people that are flocking to the big cities. So they wanted to encourage more industry to be based out in rural areas. And in this particular case, it's renewable, it's super low cost because there aren't a lot of buyers for it. It's in the middle of nowhere, which means that your mining servers are not going to be waking anybody up. And it's also actually pretty cold, which means that it is quite low cost to keep your miners cold. So there are very strong economic reasons why it exists. It is not a political thing. It is not a grab. It is the reality that our world is in a situation where it has created that environment. But more and more we're finding that mining activity is becoming much more centralized. There's a lot of activity going on in Washington State. There's a lot of activity going on in Alberta as well. So we're super positive. We don't think that it's a problem. And we encourage the Chinese to keep on mining. So the thing about this system, and I'm not going to quote the Gandhi quote, but I'll refer to it. We're at that point now where the system is halfway between trying to figure out, is it fighting or is it accepting? Do we win or is it still fighting? And the reason for that is that it is a largely unknown thing. It is something where we can't say with certainty what does this end up looking like? And because you can't phone somebody and say, listen, what are your plans? There is no one person that can tell you how this all pans out. And so it is an uncomfortable place to be in. It is fundamentally disruptive to financial services, but that doesn't make it a bad thing. It doesn't mean that it's trying to break the system. Arguably, what's going to happen over the next couple of years is that you're going to have choice, and choice is not a bad thing. The fact that you will be able to have a Bitcoin wallet or a wallet that has another cryptocurrency, that you'll be able to have another wallet that has got fiat in it, is not a bad thing. Because even if we never get to a position where Bitcoin replaces all fiat, and I don't think that that will ever happen, it will change the system enough so that we will get the desired result. And for me, plus you will have the added benefit of still having the option of choosing Bitcoin when it makes most sense. And I think that we've still achieved the objective. Bitcoin has achieved its objective if that happens. And I think that in the short term, we're going to see, and certainly we have already seen, that there are some really weird things going on. So for example, there's already legislation being put forward in the UK and Australia, which is not specifically targeted at Bitcoin, but it does give you an idea of this paranoid world that we live in. And it talks about unexplained wealth being a crime, which talks to this idea of like, if I do not know how you got that thing, then it's probably got something to do with something I don't fully understand, don't control, and that must make it bad. And so we're in a really dangerous situation where the system is fighting back. And there are other countries that are taking a very much more progressive view. And I think that ultimately we will win. I think the former governor of the Chinese central bank said, you can't kill Bitcoin. The best thing that you can do is make a decision that it will be around and that you had better make a decision about how do you regulate it. And I think that regulation is going to be a theme for 2017. Just yesterday, and I was in fact we were at a briefing session with the Financial Intelligence Center in Centurion, and they're wanting to understand who should be reporting entities on cryptocurrency. And I think that as long as we keep engaging and as long as we try to prevent a situation where they make some silly decisions about who should be those reporting entities and what they should be reporting on, I think we're going to be okay for the most part. Are there some bad regulations that already exist? Good example, BitLicense is a complete disaster. All it effectively does is drive financial innovation outside of New York State. It doesn't stop Bitcoin. It doesn't stop the technology. So, and we're in fact working with one of our members who is fighting the BitLicense, and his business he is a small business that enables local businesses to accept Bitcoin, and he's classified under those regulations as a money transmitter, and he has to jump through a whole lot of different hoops. So there is a lot of work to be done, but most of that work is about engaging and informing. And I think like I said, I think we're going to be okay. But that's going to be the key theme for 2017 in cryptocurrency. And the good thing is that Bitcoin is actually doing pretty good in terms of the value of the network. So to Tanya's point, she asked, have you ever seen, did anybody else do a Gartner hype cycle? Well, if you look carefully, this is a Gartner hype cycle as well. And what it tells us is that the first time that Bitcoin hit its all-time high of about $1,100 and odd, there was nothing fundamental that was underpinning the network. It was just this massive exuberance for like, wow, we finally might have a solution to some of the challenges that we have in our financial system. And this time around in 2017, it's a dramatically different situation. There's much more liquidity. There are far more players. The system is more sophisticated, more advanced. We've got a much higher likelihood of making it stick. So what's happening to Bitcoin now? So for those of you that follow the Bitcoin story, you're probably aware of the fact that for the last 2 years, we've been trying to figure out whether or not we increase the block size or whether or not we adopt segregated witness. And the reality is that I can say with a high level of confidence that we still don't know what the right solution to that is. But what we are doing, and what I've come to realize about this is that it is part of Bitcoin. It is the way that it works. It resists coercion. It resists influence. It does not want to be controlled. There is no person that controls it. There is no group that controls it. You do not get together and suddenly say, we're going to do this thing with Bitcoin. And that's not a bad thing. It's a very frustrating thing when you're in it, but it's not a bad thing because it means that we're ultimately going to end up with a network that is far more robust and far more capable of some of the challenges that it's going to come up against. Do I think that by the end of 2017, I think two things are going to happen. Number one is I do think that segregated witness will be activated on the network, but more importantly, I do think that there's going to be an increase in the block size as well. I think both are going to happen. And I think that the more important thing in terms of understanding why is segregated witness such an important advancement on the protocol is that it fixes some of the historical problems that have existed, one of them being transaction malleability, or the ability to change some of the transaction parameters during the process. But the more important thing is that it enables something called time blocks, or time block transactions. And what that does is it enables a whole new payment network. So in the future, Bitcoin is highly unlikely to be a transaction network. It's going to be a settlement layer. And so you're going to have a level 2, which is going to enable you to do very low-cost, instantaneous transactions, very much sort of along the lines of, we always use the analogy of Bitcoin network at the moment can do 4 transactions per second, max, which is really ridiculous. And Visa can do 70,000 transactions per second, and we want to get closer to the Visa. But that's not going to happen at the protocol level, because at the protocol level, we're always viewing it in terms of security versus speed, always. And so it will not be the fastest network, but it is going to be the most secure. And the layers that happen on top of it is what's going to really make the interesting things happen. And as I said, just a couple of days ago, Bitcoin hit its all-time high again. And depending on which exchange you're talking about, it could be 1,210, it could be 1,236. But the principle here is that there's never been a greater belief in the future of Bitcoin than now. And one might argue that some of this valuation is reflected in the fact that for the first time, there is an exchange-traded fund which is being considered and where we'll get a decision on the 11th of March. So the SEC is effectively reviewing this exchange-traded fund, and the idea there is that institutional investors will be able to buy Bitcoin without actually holding Bitcoin. Now, fundamentally, that is right now, we think that it's not a good thing for Bitcoin to have that kind of money that would want to come into the system. So current estimates are that if the ETF is approved, there'll be about $300 million that will almost immediately want to go into Bitcoin. And that's simply just a reflection of the fact that there's a new asset class that's available, and let's see how it goes. But what it does is it creates a whole bunch of other challenges, and it's too early. We are not supportive of it. The good thing about it is that it's probably got a 10 to 15% chance of being approved, and we think that that's a true reflection of how ready the network is for that kind of money. So the more likely scenario, I hope, is that we'll see an ETF in the US in 2 to 3 years' time, and we'll be ready for it then. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the startups that are doing some interesting things. Because I wanted to talk about financial inclusion and using Bitcoin, I'm going to talk about some of the startups that are doing some interesting things. Now, the principle here is not that these startups are massively profitable or at some huge level of scale. It talks to the business model, and it talks about how, using this kind of technology, you can address and serve people in a completely different way. And whether it turns out that Bitcoin is the solution to this, or whether or not these kinds of things happen elsewhere in the system is not really the point. The point is that we're going to see fundamental changes in the way that financial services are provided, more towards peer-to-peer business models. So what BTC Jam does, for example, is that you go on there, you tell the network or the marketplace what it is that you want to loan, and ultimately what happens is that people go into the market, make themselves available as lenders, choose what the rate is that they're prepared to lend money at, and there are other considerations that can enter into this as well, because what's interesting about that is it doesn't have to be a credit score. It can be anything you want it to be in terms of considering What is the reason? Why would I give you money, and how do I know I'm going to get that money back? And that's really, really different. And once again, there is no bank, there is no custodian relationship. There is just, I want to lend, you're going to borrow, and we're going to get this transaction done. And the market determines what the rate is at which that happens. Those of you that are familiar with, say, SnapScan or Zapper in the South African context will understand that QR codes fundamentally change peer-to-peer payments and make electronic cash transactions much easier to do. And we think that in the early days, there was a belief, again, because of my history in digital marketing, there was a belief that QR codes were going to change digital marketing and change activation. And the interesting thing about it is that QR codes are actually proving to be fundamental to how do you increase the likelihood that Bitcoin is going to be adopted for cash transactions. Abra is an awesome startup. And what Abra essentially does is, the early days of Bitcoin, there was a lot of talk about Bitcoin is going to change remittances, it's going to make Western Union obsolete. And then not too long ago, a couple of months ago, Western Union kind of laughed at everybody, said, yeah, okay, but it's not really having an impact on our business. But what Abra does, and the reason for that was that in the early days, people were kind of like, wait, we're going to create an agent network in the one country and an agent network in the other country, and then we're going to make sure that there's enough transaction activity happening between them, because you need an on-ramp and you need an off-ramp. Because if you can't buy something in Bitcoin, then you kind of need local currency. And what Abra did, which fundamentally changes that business model and makes it even more robust, is it enables everybody in this room today, if you wish to sign up as an agent. And you can turn your phone on and off and decide that you are not available to do that kind of exchange. And you don't even have to worry about where did the money come from. In terms of the currency unit, you don't have to worry about Bitcoin is involved. Bitcoin is operating in the background. But what it does enable you to do is people in your area will find you and say, I see that you're prepared to give me my 1,000 Rand that actually originally came from America. And so we will exchange, snap QR codes, and the transaction will happen, and you will give me the cash, and I'm happy. I've solved my problem. And the transaction fees are determined again completely by what's happening in the marketplace. Team Brella takes that same concept and extends it to insurance and says, well, what if we fundamentally change the way that we provide and take risk? What if we said, I'm prepared to take this level of risk at this cost? Wouldn't that dramatically change the way that insurance is provided today? And if you had to put down, in this particular case, you put down deposits which are sort of equivalent to so that it would enable payouts, once again, you're changing the way that these kinds of services are being provided and the cost at which they are being provided, and frankly, who qualifies for many of these services. I am super excited about this startup, which is based in Cape Town. And what they're going to do, and they haven't publicly launched yet, but they are out there, so I'm not kind of spoiling anything for them. They're effectively creating a zero-cost transactional bank account. And what that does, it dramatically changes and makes more likely the chances that everybody is going to be able to have a bank account. And once you have a bank account, lots of very interesting things start to happen. It's just unfortunate that right now it's very difficult to provide a bank account economically with the current technology and with the current system. But this kind of technology enables very, very exciting and new developments like Wala. And then finally, I'm going to talk about a project that I've been very involved in for the last 30 days and where we are actually not the foundation, but where I'm an investor. And what this is it talks to venture financing in the future. So what Augmentors effectively did, or what Augmentors is a virtual reality game. And we decided that we needed to raise about $1 million to complete the development of the game, but we didn't really want to put the full $1 million into the game ourselves, and more importantly, we wanted to create a community of people that were interested in the development of the game. And so what we did was we created 770 million tokens. And those tokens enable you to acquire in-game credits and get access to creatures that you cannot get, you will not get ever again. And those creatures are stored on the Bitcoin blockchain, and those tokens exist on the Bitcoin blockchain. And so what it enabled us to do is to raise $1 million in 30 days from all over the world for a game that is being developed in Cape Town. I'm going to show you a video, and then you'll understand a little bit more about it and why it's so disruptive to the way that venture financing will work in the future. There's supposed to be a video here. Broke the cardinal rule. Never insert video into slides. Okay, here we go.
Augmenters is a mobile augmented reality game that summons virtual
Can anybody hear?
creatures into the real world as you trade, swap, train, and place your creatures in battles against foes and enemies. Augmenters is the brand new futuristic game backed by the Bitcoin blockchain, a first of its kind. To raise the $1 million to complete the development of this game, we structured an ICO that will run for 30 days. Purchase data bits at roughly 5 cents a data bit, and you can be rewarded with rare one-of-a-kind creatures. As the sale progresses, the data bits will become more expensive.
Okay. Should I just pause this? Okay. I like to think that it's exciting, so I hope you don't mind. Are we good? I think the principle here is that in the future, even venture financing is going to be peer-to-peer. And in this particular case, by the way, we lawyered up big time here to make sure that we're not issuing a security. So the reality is that we think that all venture financing in the future will eventually evolve to a point where you will not go to an angel investor or a bank or a venture capital fund that will have to go to LPs and raise money and invest funds over 8 years and return later on. It's going to be a question of who's going to consume your product, your target segment. You go straight to them, you tell them what you're going to do, and they buy into the program, and they become part of that process. And I think that fundamentally what Bitcoin changes, it doesn't just change financial freedom, but it enables us once again to think that we can all do everything that we want to do in a peer-to-peer way. We don't have to have trusted intermediaries. It's not necessary. Thank you. Do we have time for a couple of questions?
It's time for lots of questions.
Cool.
So the time frame for when it would be closer to the Visa network in terms of when it will become a serious contender?
So, I can't possibly answer that question. My best guess at this stage is that we're probably 2 to 3 years away from the Lightning Network truly delivering on that capability. But it could happen faster. And again, because there's nobody driving a specific product roadmap, there is only contribution to the project. It's difficult to say exactly how long it's going to take. And I think that that's also one of the reasons why, as from an outsider's perspective, it can feel like it's taking really long. And what's the problem? And why are you not telling us when this thing is going to be delivered? Because we don't know. And I think that these problems that are being worked on are very, very, very complex. And they've never been done before. There is no way that somebody can go, oh, well, it was done like that before. And again, to do it in a completely trustless and secure way, knowing that the network will be attacked, means that there is extra caution that is exercised before anything is taken live on the Bitcoin network. So it can appear as if the Bitcoin network is like not evolving. And the reality is that it is, but it's not all going live yet.
Cool.
Hi, Llew.
Hi.
Great talk, by the way.
Cool, thanks.
2 questions. First one is, you had you kind of said with certainty that Lightning Network will come online. Lightning is based on segregated witness. You were very confident earlier that it was going to happen this year, and I hope it does. So just want to find out whether you think another coin could come and take dominance, which handles scalability better. And then the second question is, how did you market your initial coin offering?
Okay. So the first question about how do I know when Lightning is going to activate? I don't. All I know is that we actively engage with miners, we engage with people, protocol developers, we engage with exchanges and wallet providers and everybody else, and we kind of go, what is everybody actually trying to achieve here? And what do we think is the most likely outcome? And is there a way that a lot of what gets done is about overcoming some of the challenges around people not necessarily say for example, on the mining side, not necessarily fully understanding what's happening at the protocol side and vice versa. And there are cultural issues there as well, and then there are economic benefits as well. So I can't say with certainty, but based upon the discussions that are taking place at the moment, I think that people realize, if I haven't met anybody that has said that Lightning is bad. They're only concerned about segregated witness being a very, very complex piece of software that nobody truly understands how it's going to change economic incentives and how it's going to change the network. And if it gets deployed onto a network that is currently worth $19 billion and it doesn't work as intended at scale, we have a very big problem. And so I can understand that the miners which hold a large amount of Bitcoin, simply because they mine them, I can understand that they wouldn't want to activate something that has a high degree of uncertainty. I get it. So what do I think is going to happen in order to prove whether or not segregated witness can actually handle? And it doesn't mean it hasn't been tested. Of course it's been tested, but it's not on the live network. I suspect, and it's public knowledge, so I'm not giving away anything, but I think that we've got a high likelihood of Litecoin adopting segregated witness and putting Lightning on top of Litecoin to prove that it does work. And then we'll get a better sense of whether or not we should deploy onto Bitcoin. Oh, how do we promote it? So the nature of these things being peer-to-peer is that we require people to be as excited about the project as we are. So most of what we did is influencer marketing. We did use paid marketing as well, but it was predominantly about creating strong incentives for people to keep talking about the project they're already involved in and to earn further game credits that way. Plus the fact that it was, I'll never forget this quote, there is something super interesting that happens when you have this sort of emerging technology and you create something that's never been done before that people get excited about. The one comment in particular from a buyer, and this is from somebody who spent, I think, 10 Bitcoin. So that is like $10,000. And he said, I don't know what a God creature is, but I love it and I want one. And that gives you an idea of like who we're addressing in this particular game.
Cool. Any more questions?
Hello, good afternoon.
Hi.
You keep on saying that there's no one sort of controlling it. Don't you think that is the main reason why there's sort of less adoption to this whole concept? Because especially in the financial services industry, you would like to think that there should be some sort of regulation or control which is going to govern the whole system. Thank you.
You're right, it does slow down adoption, but it also makes the network far more secure and robust. And it's one of those things where it was designed to be like that from the beginning. It's not something we decided upon later on. So we go with the way that it works. I think credit to the core team is that they actively resist us creating a governance forum where you can kind of get miners together and protocol developers and wallet providers. And because the challenge is that if you're trying to change a system and the system fights back against you, then you would create a social attack vector. So it cannot be controlled, and that's by design, and that's not a bad thing. But it does slow it down, and there's a good reason why it slows it down. And so it is frustrating, as I said earlier on, but it will prevail.
Hi, Llew. Well, that's loud. So my question is around augmenters, right? So everything that happens within the game, the more creatures that you want to buy and so forth, are transactions that happen within the game, right? On the Bitcoin network. Obviously now this has been done with other applications, but they use in-app purchases. What do you think it looks like in terms of a timeline and adoption for other applications that have in-app purchases to start using the blockchain for these in-app purchases? It's
a good question. We were asking ourselves whether or not people actually care about the fact that if you if you go into a game and you purchase, I don't know, a new shield or a new sword or a new, it doesn't matter that you don't actually own that thing and cannot take it with you. And the best, I think that the best answer to that is to understand that we already have a working relationship with Spells of Genesis. And what Spells of Genesis is a trading card game that exists also based on blockchain, but it's not augmented reality. And what you will be able to do, and it's not live yet, but you will be able to use Augmentor's creatures and you'll be able to move them into Spells of Genesis and use them on a different game. And they won't have the same powers and abilities because obviously that's dependent on what those game parameters are. But it does make for some super interesting things.
Great, Llew, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Excellent.